Chapter 166, Taking a Risk. Until Xie Weiren got into the carriage, they all went far away, and Zhang Xuning was still a little confused. What's the matter with this man? She pondered the time when Yan Lingang's class teacher returned to the court in the previous life, and she also said to Xie Wei something similar to how everyone would not owe each other after reciprocating kindness, but the other party didn't seem to have such a big reaction. I always felt a little strange about Xie Wei these two times. But what is strange, Zhang Xuning really can't say. Thinking that since I have no clue, I simply put this mess aside. After all, Xie Wei is a master who is unpredictable, and unpredictable, if you take the time to figure out what he thinks, how can people mix up in that turbulent court? The important thing is that Xie Wei agreed. Although she contacted Zheng Bao and found Zhou Yinzi outside, if this power is to succeed, it can almost be called a gamble, and it may not be foolproof. However, if a person like Xie Wei, who has a decisive ability in the court, is willing to help a little, the possibility of success will be greatly increased. And even if it fails, it can avoid implicating innocent people like Zheng Bao. Success is in sight. Zhang Xuning almost jumped 3 feet high when she thought of this, and when she returned to her room, she was even more calm. After being intimidated by Xie Wei's words, there were not even half of the people in the house who came to trouble her. She was only worried that the heart surnamed Xie was reluctant. But it was very unexpected. After the other party agreed, he actually kept his promise, and early the next morning, Jianshu came to the house in person to invite, saying that Mr. Xie was entrusted by Lord Zhang, and he should do more for the second girl Zhang, and this time he invited Zhang Xuning to go to Xie Mansion to take the school examination. Zhang Xuning really believed it at first. When I arrived at the taxi mansion, I was very nervous, and I tried to recall the book I read last night and the piano I practiced. Unexpectedly, when the person entered the Qin Hall, it was empty, and Xie Wei was nowhere to be seen. Jianshu bowed and said, "After coming back yesterday, Mr. explained to me that we should first collect the matters of Her Royal Highness the eldest princess and her relatives, and some official documents did not dare to be handed over to others to look around, so I simply invited Ning Yi our girl to come and see. Sir, he went to the Yuan Pavilion, and he left something to say. If you have something, you will directly order your subordinates, and it will be done for you." Zhang Xuning then understood. Xie Wei clearly disliked her, and estimated that he knew that what she was going to do this time was extremely dangerous, and he didn't want to get involved in this troubled water, but he was forced by her to coerce her with kindness, so he had to agree. Simply can't see out of sight and clean your heart, throw a powerful sword book to her to use, and avoid it yourself. She couldn't wait for it, too. If the Lord of Yama, surnamed Xie, sat down in front of her, and she wanted to discuss with him seriously about dropping bags and robbing people, she would really be scared to death before she was worried about death. Zhang Xuning was happy, and suddenly felt that the air in the Qin Hall was too tight, and immediately regarded it as his own home, and he didn't even seem to be out of town to invite Jianshu to sit down with him, and first study those cases related to relatives. "Where do you dare to sit in the sword book?" He stood aside. Zhang Xuning wanted to read something. He handed it a folded paper. Zhang Xuning wanted to write something. He polished the pen and ink. From the beginning to the end, I didn't dare to exceed the rules, and I didn't relax because Xie Wei was not there. The people around Xie Wei are always as strict as him. Zhang Xuning only remembers that in his previous life, he occasionally talked to Xie Wei's sword and sword book alone a few times, and he just said that the two of them were so temperamental, and they didn't see him sit twice, so they just stopped and concentrated on looking at the things in their hands. Major events such as princesses and relatives are handled by the Ministry of Rites. Pushing Xiao Shu out to make peace with him didn't work, and the emperor didn't mean to change his mind at all. That is to say, if the soft method does not work, it must be hard to take it. At this time, it becomes very important to understand the process before and after sending the princess to kiss. The day when Shenzai went to Tatar and made peace with her relatives was calculated by Qin Tian, and it was set for the 21st day of March, less than a month away. The Ministry of Engineering built a sturdy cart and selected 4 horses to pull it. The day before, the prince would worship the temple with the emperor. On the day of departure, he had to get up early to trace his makeup, put on a phoenix crown, put on a hijab, and go all the way out of the palace after bidding farewell to the emperor of his relatives. In accordance with the rules of the past dynasties, he was escorted by 800 good sons and daughters selected from the Yulin army. It was late spring when we set off, and the weather was just right for the northwest, not too cold and not too hot. There are roughly 2 ways to save people. First, after the princess leaves Beijing, the guards are lax, and there is a chance to rob people or drop bags halfway. It's just that if it is very simple to rob people, if you want to drop the bag, if the guards have seen Shenzai's true face on the road, the matter will be revealed no matter what. The second is to start before the princess leaves Beijing. After bidding farewell to the relatives, they will directly board the carriage and leave the palace, and the people of the royal family will only watch from the city tower to see from afar. If they are more courageous, find a woman with a similar appearance, familiar with the affairs of the palace and willing to replace. As long as they are not found to embark on the road of harmony, the guards have never seen the princess. Even if they see the stand-in, they will not suspect. However, this scheme also has a huge drawback, that is, it is too dangerous. The palace is heavily guarded, and it is not easy to act. After pondering in Xie Wei's mansion for a few mornings, Zhang Xuning weighed the power in his hands and the limits of Xie Wei's help, and decisively crossed out the second plan. The safest option is the first option. She carefully flipped through the map of Xie Wei's mansion, and after several thoughts, she drew a line on it and circled several points. However, robbing people halfway is bound to be an elite team to succeed, and the 800 Feather Forest Army is not child's play. Although she still has some money left in her hand, she can do the things she should do, and it is enough to arrange Shenzai's next life. But if you want to buy people from the outside to rob and kiss the princess, there is a risk of turning around at every turn. One may not have the ability, the second may not have the courage, and the third is that once the matter is defeated, no one can eat and walk around. Zhou Yunzi can certainly use it, but Zhang Xuning also has scruples about this person. This is the best time to turn to Xie Wei. Zhang Xuning told Jianshu about her plans. Others don't know, only Xie Wei is an ordinary minister, but she knows that his back is not so simple just by looking at the skills of the sword book and the sword and piano, not to mention the things that Xie Wei did in the previous life. It would be strange if he had no side to rely on in his hands. After Secretary Jian came down, he said that he would convey it when Xie Wei came back, asking Zhang Xuning to come back tomorrow. These days, if she is in the house, Xie Wei will definitely not be there. Zhang Xuning only said that this person's temper was getting more and more weird, but he didn't expect this matter to be particularly difficult, and he should agree. Who would have thought that when he came the next day, Jianshu actually said, Mr. said that if the ordinary mountain bandits robbed the princess, it would inevitably lead the court to investigate inward, and Her Royal Highness the eldest princess may not be able to escape for a while. Since Ning Er has decided to use this risky trick, she might as well use both the bag drop and the robbery strategy. Yu Linjun's arrangement has his own husband's cooking, and then only pushed a vain ghost out to replace the princess, saying that he died in the robbery. With the princess's token, no one would have thought that the real eldest princess Her Royal Highness has been out of the shell. In this way, the future problems can be eliminated. Zhang Xuning listened to it, but her heart sank. How could she not have thought of such a plan? After all, it can be done with 100, and the royal family will never have the heart to find Shenzai. It's just that robbing people is still easy to say, To push an innocent vain ghost to come out and die immediately for Shen Zai, one is difficult to find a candidate, and the other is unbearable. Moreover, with her understanding of Xie Wei in her previous life, she was only scratching the surface. Jiang Xuning raised her head and looked at the sword book, and asked, I'm afraid I haven't finished saying this, right, and relatives are related to peace between the two countries. If something happens to the princess, it will be complicated. Since the gentleman agreed to the plan to rob the people, how could he waste this great opportunity? At that time, the robbers who went to kill the princess were afraid that they would not only pretend to be mountain bandits, but also leave behind some clues related to the Tatar royal family, so they would set up suspicions, provoke mutual suspicion between the two countries, and even set off a war. The sword book was silent. Jiang Xuning felt that his heart was tight. If there is a war, soldiers will be used. Xiao's papier-mâché tiger is vulnerable, and the military situation is critical. Even if the government and the opposition criticize and the emperor is unwilling, I am afraid that I will have to rush thousands of miles, recall the old generals, and restart the loyalty. In this way, the Yanji Marquis mansion will return. Jian Shuxi didn't expect Jiang Xuning to think of this, almost the same as his husband's plan yesterday. Jiang Xuning said, yes and no. Jianshu didn't answer, just lowered his head and said, in short, Mr. said that since you ask him for help, he does help you, you plan what you can plan, and Mr. plans what Mr. wants to plan, and it does not hinder it. After a long time, Jiang Xuning finally smiled. Compared with the overall situation that Xie Wei is planning, she is really shallow and petty. If you want to fall out with Xie Wei, saving Shen Zai will become a 10 out of 10 adventure, and I don't know if the surname Xie is a stumbling block behind it. But after agreeing, the direction of this matter is certainly a little different from what she expected, but at least saving Her Royal Highness the eldest princess is 9 out of 10. And the home mansion. She thought for a moment and didn't say anything more. At the end, he only said, Mr. is thoughtful, so he naturally follows Mr. S. way. As soon as the matter was met, preparations were intensified. The matter of Shenju, the king of Linzi, choosing a concubine was really lively for a while, and the selection of the main concubine and the side concubine at the same time also made Jingzhong have a lot of discussions. In March, there is a lantern festival temple fair, and the people pray for Her Royal Highness the eldest princess who is about to go to get married, and they celebrate for several days. Beneath the boiling surface, a bold plan is unfolding. The time of preparation and waiting flies, and the day before the kiss is in the blink of an eye. Everything is going smoothly. It's just that after the end of the Feng Chen Palace's accompanying reading, Jiang Xuning couldn't find a suitable reason to enter the palace, and she couldn't see Shen Zai again. But she is not in a hurry, everything that should be prepared has been prepared, just wait for the day before the kiss, enter the palace with others to bid farewell to the princess, and then the plan and inventory will be laid out, which is still seamless. But Jiang Xuning never expected that at this juncture, there was a change that made her unprepared. The news came back from the palace just now, saying that concubine Xian proposed to the Holy Lord to replace all the original Yulin army with the Praetorian Guard. Jianshu followed up the whole process of rescuing the princess, and his face sank a little at this moment, and continued, originally, many of the Yulin army were the old departments of the home mansion, which had been properly installed by Mr. Wang, and there was no mistake in replacing them halfway. But concubine Xian insisted that everyone be replaced by the saint's henchmen, and she tried her best to ensure that the matter of harmony was safe. In this way, in front of so many people, it is difficult to replace the princess with a plan to hide from the world. Unless concubine Xian, Xiaoshu, separated from the past and present lives, Jiang Xuning thought that she was still on the same page with this person after all. She said, unless you abandon the method of substitution in the middle of the way. The Praetorian Guards have never seen the princess, and they need to complete the bag after the princess says goodbye and before she leaves the palace. That's true, it's just that this method is too risky, and it's... At this point, Jianshu paused. Zhang Xuning looked at him. Jianshu I said, and Mr. thinks that concubine Xian's move is quite unusual, but she seems to be aware of the rescue of the princess, and she asked the saint to handle the matter of the eldest princess and her relatives, and it seems to be a for-tat confrontation with you. Zhang Xuning understood what he wanted to say. Xie Wei meant that Xiao Shu's purpose was so clear, as if she knew who was behind the discussion that pushed her to make peace with the eldest princess a while ago, and she was worried about whether she had revealed any flaws and feet in the past. Jianshu asked, the substitution in the palace is not as good as the substitution outside the palace, and the risk is extremely dangerous, is the second girl Ning Dash? Nope. Zhang Xuning had a fire burning in her heart, suddenly got up, and sneered. She dares to ask for her own affairs, and she also has the courage to take this opportunity to give her a big gift, wouldn't it be right? Ask to handle the matter of harmony, but if this matter went wrong under her nose, with the temper of Shen Lang, the dog emperor, she couldn't eat and walked around. Just as Yuruyi's case was framed at the beginning, she dared to conclude that Xiao Shu was behind it without evidence. Xiao Shu vaguely felt that there was someone behind the discussion of peace and kinship, and it was not unusual to conclude that this matter had nothing to do with her. There are very few people who have the ability and can do it. Zhang Xuaning's jealousy of Xiao Shu and Xiao Shu's hostility towards Zhang Xuaning are clear to each other. Even if they cover it up, it will not cause them to suspect innocent people. I also know that Xiao Shu must have opened a big net this time, waiting for her to vote. But Zhang Xuaning really wanted to break through. There is still 3 points of hope for taking risks, but to stop here is to watch Shen Zai's soul disappear. Chapter 167, The Princess's Change. Jianshu looked at her posture and wanted to say something, but in the end he didn't say anything. Zhang Xuning left Xie Mansion with his front foot, and he went to the secluded pavilion with his back foot. Xie Wei is playing chess with Lucien. He was a breezy and light-hearted attitude, but Lucien on the other side had a loveless face, and he couldn't reach out and knock his scalp off, and when he raised his eyes, he saw the sword book coming in from outside, and he was as relieved as seeing a savior. Xie Juan didn't know which tendon he had drawn, and he came to play chess with him every day. I'm going to bald him on the head. Xie Wei looked at the chessboard in front of him and asked directly, what did she say? Jianshu secretly pinched a cold sweat and said, Second Miss Ning is determined to take a risk, it seems that she has to save people. Moreover, for the one in the palace, it seems that he has an old grudge, and he doesn't plan to retreat, but wants to take this opportunity to trap the other party. Xie Wei fell, and finally raised his head. Lucien looked at the master and servant secretly, and took advantage of Xie Wei's efforts to turn his head. His fingers quietly climbed onto the chessboard, and quickly picked up the 2 sunspots in the right corner and hid them under the chess table. Xie Wei said, it seems like something she can do. Of course, Jianshu saw Lucien's movements, his eyes drifted for a moment, and he replied to Xie Wei, then the plan is still the same, but Li Daido's Wang's step is advanced. Xie Wei said, this is a rare opportunity. In the past, Ning Er spent a lot of money to set off a discussion of peace in the market, and we also contributed to the troubles behind the scenes. Although concubine Xiao Shu failed to reach the plan to let her replace Shen Zai to get married, it caused doubts about Hekin among the people. And the sect leader is also eyeing him, although he can't intervene in the affairs of the capital now, but if he can't do anything with his relatives, he will not stand idly by. In this way, just splash a little spark, and then push it again, arouse the anger of the people, and it can create a situation of internal and external difficulties for the imperial court, and even if Shen Lang does not want to recall the Yan family, he is afraid that he will have to give in. If you miss this one, you don't know when. Lucien picked up his white sun, raised his eyebrows and said, "Even if you don't want to stop, you really don't waste any opportunity." Xie Wei turned his eyes to look at him. He didn't have a weak heart. Shi Shiren dropped his white piece on the chessboard, and continued, "It's clear that it's your second girl Ning who is charging in front, and there is a black heart like you behind you who is calculating even deeper. Tisk, after the Yuruyi case, most of your eyeliner in the palace has been cleaned up. Renning Er girl is better, she is much more capable than you, and even the eunuchs who serve the emperor clothes can be bribed. If you want me to say, don't be so troublesome, bypass Zhang Xuning and collude with Zheng Bao, and directly ask him to poison the emperor, wouldn't it be 100? Where is it so easy to poison the palace? But everything that wants to go into the emperor's mouth must be filled with silverware, and then passed through the eunuch's mouth, and the poisoning is not well designed, but I am afraid that the emperor will poison himself before he is poisoned." Lucien was just joking casually. But the case of Yuruyi was indeed secretly manipulated by the vain ghost Gong Gai Cheng after he arrived in the capital, and without Xie Wei's consent, he used his eyeliner in the palace, which attracted the attention of the Empress Dowager Xiao and the emperor, and carried out a major purge in the palace, so that he did not leave many usable people in the palace. Lucien was using this to satirize him. Xie Wei didn't accept this stubble, and said calmly, "If Zheng Bao is a person who can be easily bought with bad conduct, I'm afraid that it will not be so easy to win over Ning Er, let alone agree to secretly help Ning Er help her open the door in the palace." Lucien was talking nonsense and saw that his attention was no longer on the chessboard, so he secretly breathed a sigh of relief, and urged after he fell, "It's your turn to hurry up, I don't believe I can't win you today." Xie Wei looked back at the chessboard and dropped a piece up. He didn't find out. Lucien was secretly happy, his tail was cocked, and he said pretendly, "You said that you treat me here as your own home, and if you don't give me money for tea, it's not cheap for others to ask me to accompany you. The delicate little girl goes to your house every morning, but you avoid it like a snake and scorpion. Xiejuan, you said you shouldn't quarrel with others, right?" On the side, Jianzhi's eyelids jumped wildly. Xie Wei slowly raised his gaze, his expression was unmoved, and said, "Lu Zheyin, if there is another time, you hide a few chess pieces, and you will eat a few of them." Lucien instantly stiffened. "Does your grandmas have eyes on the back of your head?" Asterisk. The next morning, Mingfeng Palace. The palace people were silent, each holding the powder of the skirt. Su Shang'ai personally took the snail die in the box and drew eyebrows for Shen Zai. Halfway through the painting, the tears couldn't stop falling. On the contrary, Shen Zai herself was like a person who had nothing to do, and wiped her tears for Su Shang'ai, laughed and said, "Su Shang'ai watched Zai grow up, and now Zai is getting married, she should be happy for Zai, why are you still crying?" She didn't say that it was okay, but when she said that Su Shang'ai couldn't even hold the thrush's die steadily. She took a die from Su Shang'ai's hand, leaned over to the rhombic mirror and gently swiped it with one stroke, and said, "The girl's family has been in her family for 10 years, and she always wants to get married, but some people marry close and some people marry far. In any case, Su Shang'ai can't be with Zai for the rest of her life, I always have to take a look at the world outside, and I always have to carry the wind and rain outside. At this juncture, crying only makes people look down, so why not smile and show some courage?" The two eyebrows are slender and long, like two curved willow leaves, but the shallow scar under the corner of the eye is still a little obvious. Shenzai put down Luozide, picked up the thin pen on the makeup, dipped it in a little cherry powder, and slowly traced it, outlining it into a petal of falling cherry blossoms according to the shape of the scar in the old days. I looked at it when I put my pen down, but I couldn't help but laugh. She remembered Zhang Xuning and said, "This makeup has to be Ningning, so that the painting is perfect, just like the real thing." But I went to kiss, far away from Yanmen Pass, and when I arrived in Tatar, no one painted this makeup for me, so I painted it a few times first, and it was good to be familiar with my hands. Su Shang-ai wiped her tears and said, Your Highness bids farewell to the Holy Lord and the Queen Mother today, and the old companions in the palace will also enter the palace to bid farewell to you, and then ask the second girl Zhang to draw a picture for you. Shenzai smiled. She's afraid that she won't cry and become a tearful person, and she won't even be able to hold the pen steadily. Where can she paint for me? This scar was left when she was still in infancy, when she was rebelled by King Pingnan and Tianxiao, and the sword grazed her face, but fortunately, the nurse protected her under her before she died, and she escaped. For those in the palace who have experienced this scar is a constant reminder of the calamity and shame that the royal family has experienced. When she was young, she didn't dare to look in the mirror. When she got older, everyone around her told her that she was a princess who was high, and no matter what she looked like, she could get whatever she wanted. Because of the royal blood flowing in her body, there will be no change because of this scar. After a long time, she also believed. Because these people are really right, there is almost nothing in the world that she can't get. When the palace was bored, the children of the princes and nobles were called into the palace to play, and everyone flattered themselves and everyone accompanied them. You can sit on your father's lap and play with the twists and turns on the imperial case, or you can hide behind the back of the imperial brother and pull his hair, go to the Yanji Marquis mansion to play and cause trouble, and Yan Lin is behind the blame. But now she doesn't want to kiss. The people who used to spoil her, indulge her, and care about her have all changed their faces. They became embarrassed, ruthless, cold, and hateful, so that she could not even recognize them. So at this time, I realized, as this scar that can never be erased shows, even if she is a princess, her fate is sometimes not in her control, and it is precisely because she is a princess that fate has become more and more unpredictable and difficult to resist. 20 years ago, it was the sword of the thief who aimed at her. 20 years later, what hurt her was the abandonment of her blood relatives. The entire Mingfeng palace has been hung into a piece of splendor. She stared at the extraordinarily calm face in the mirror, only to feel that she seemed to have lost some weight these days, so that it was not like her former self, but she was not very nostalgic. When he lowered his eyes and got up, there was a rush outside. It was a gorgeous but cold voice. Your Royal Highness the eldest princess, you have been delayed for more than a moment, and the Holy Lord and the Queen Mother should have waited for a long time. Shenzai walked out. Outside the palace gate, there were 2 guards, and they were waiting for it, and they didn't know how much stricter than the previous Mingfeng palace. The palace people and eunuchs all stood under the vermilion palace wall with their heads buried, and Xiao Shu, who had just been crowned a virtuous concubine for more than a month, stood at the forefront. Used to be a classmate and a good cousin, but now she has become her imperial sister-in-law. Shenzai glanced around. This heavy person is guarding. Is concubine Xian still worried that I will escape? Xiao Shu's makeup was bright and colorful, and she seemed to be smiling. Your Highness may not be able to escape, but if someone wants to save her. Tsh. Shenzai laughed sharply, and her gaze turned back to Xiao Shu's body leisurely. In fact, the Queen Mother has appreciated you since she was a child, and often asked me to get along with you. You and I are cousins, and I am naturally close to you. But now you have become my imperial sister-in-law, and your appearance has changed greatly, and the Queen Mother is angry with you, and you are really worthy of her cultivation. Recently, Hung Guofan has a sentence hidden in his heart, and I really want to tell you. Do you know? Xiao Shu stood at the foot of the steps, raising her eyes to look at her. Shenzai took a step down, stood 1 step higher than her, and suddenly raised her hand without warning, and slapped her directly. Smack. Xiao Shu didn't expect that the golden hairpin inserted in the bun hit the ground, and her pupils also contracted. There were a few gloomy wisps of anger in her eyes. But she didn't have a seizure, but looked back at Shenzai expressionlessly. Shenzai said flatly, "You are really cheap like this." Chapter 168, Imperial Princess. At this moment, it is not that the two of them are alone, but in front of the gate of Mingfeng Palace, in front of everyone's eyes, Shenzai's loud slap can be said to have no intention of saving Xiao Shu's face. She should be embarrassed. Even Xiao Shu herself thought that she would feel embarrassed, but there was only a kind of peace in her heart. It should be like this. She gently raised her hand to support her cheek, and her voice was as faint as smoke. "If you cannot be cheap, who doesn't want to live with dignity?" Shenzai looked at her almost with a look of pity. Xiao Shu didn't feel that she had anything to be ashamed of, and when she put down her hand, she spread out her palm and glanced at it. The anger in her eyes disappeared, and said, "Since I was very young, I thought, such a pampered and willful princess, I will do it for me. You are high up and do not know the sufferings of the world, and naturally you do not know the difficulties of being a minister and a slave." Shenzai did not speak. Xiao Shu smiled at her. "Let's go, Your Royal Highness Princess." Emperor Shenlang and Empress Dowager Xiao have indeed been waiting for a while. Shenju, the king of Linzi, was also there. Maybe the result of choosing a concubine a month ago was not satisfactory, although the marriage will not be completed until next month, but his face is already a little depressed, and he doesn't look very happy. The palace people passed the word outside, and Shenzai came from outside the palace, but she was unusually lively and pampered, and followed the rules and etiquette to salute and greet him. Xiao Shu came in behind her. The slightly red slap marks on the cheeks are not eye-catching, but they are also very obvious. The emperor with a proud face sat on a high place and saw it clearly at a glance. His eyebrows were raised, and he glanced at Shenzai again, but the corners of his lips showed a smile, but he didn't ask a word. As if he hadn't seen anything, he talked to Shenzai as usual. Empress Dowager Xiao also occasionally cares for 2 sentences. It's just that she didn't even look at Xiao Shu. The previous dynasty was turbulent, and the Xiao family was made stumbling because of the reinvestigation of the Ganzhou disaster relief silver case, and all kinds of evidence jumped out like his own eyes, which had to make the Empress Dowager Xiao suspect that Xiao Shu had sealed the virtuous concubine that night after leaving her Sinning palace that day, and she had a deal with the emperor. There is a huge royal family, and people sit in a palace, and the words of care and blessing are spoken, but they all look high-sounding and insignificant. The only one who has a little human touch may be Shenju. Since he saw Shenzai come in, his brows have been wrinkled, worrying about the wind and sand on the road for a while, admonishing the food and drink along the road for a while, and he seems to want to say something when he opens his mouth several times, but looking at the faces of the first royal brother and the queen mother, he still can't help it. He is not the head of the royal family, he grew up under the protection of his father, mother, and brother, and he has nothing to do with him in the past. But affection is also limited by his cowardice. Shenzai only thought that this royal brother was close and fun in the past, but although he was in the game today, he watched coldly, but instead noticed some things that he didn't pay attention to in the past, and saw some details that he hadn't seen in the past. As soon as the narration ended, he asked the incense to worship the gods, read out the imperial edict, and awarded the Dakian festival talisman for Shenzai to reconcile the contradictions between the two countries as the princess of Dakian after Shenzai arrived at the Xiannu. When the courtesy is exhausted, it is past the meridian. Among the wealthy nobles in Beijing, who were friends with Shenzai, such as many companions in the past, or simple-minded playmates like King Pingnan, all came to the palace to see her and visit the imperial garden with her. Although Xiao Shu had been reading with Yang Zizai, he did not follow, he only watched from a distance beside the rockery, and instructed the palace people on the side. The original guards of Mingfeng Palace have been withdrawn, and the 2 palace gates in the northwest and northeast have been retreated. Send another person to keep an eye on it carefully. If the second girl in Zhang Shilang's mansion comes, she will report to me first. The palace people are really a little confused. Xiao Shu lowered her eyes to collect the light in her eyes, and no longer glanced at everyone in the imperial garden, and returned to her palace. Zhang Xuning was late. Passing through several palace gates along the way, I felt that except for the lanterns, there was no difference from every time I entered the palace before. In the previous life, when Shenzai was edicted to make peace, she had already been elected as the Princess of Linzi, staying in her own mansion and only waiting for the marriage, and Shenzai hated her for playing tricks on her and not being close to her, so she naturally wished that this eye-catching sister-in-law would leave early. Where would she come to the palace to see her off? But there is Zhang Bao in the palace. After only passing through the 2 palace gates, before entering the imperial garden, he saw Zhang Bao coming from the direction of the Qianqing palace, and quickly said when he passed by, concubine Xian mobilized the guards, please enter the urn. The stand-in has secretly lurked in the Ming Phoenix Palace. The princess and the phoenix drove out of the palace at the 3rd moment of Yujhan, and the girl must finish the work at the 2nd moment of Yujhan, so that the princess pretended to be a palace person and walked from the Shenzhen gate, and the girl also asked herself to leave the palace as soon as possible. The 3rd quarter of Yujhan is the auspicious time for Qintian's accounting. The length of day and night in spring is similar, and the 3rd quarter of the unitary is the beginning of the day and the beginning of the month, turning from yang to yin. But Zhang Xuning pondered, it was probably the same as the exile of the Marquis of Yanji's mansion in the middle of the night, and the people were quite critical of the matter of harmony, and the court was afraid that there would be too many people in the daytime to make a mess and it would be difficult to deal with it, so he simply made up a high-sounding reason to change the time to the evening. She only nodded, didn't say anything, and walked over as if nothing had happened. The palace people led her to the imperial garden. Shenzai saw her and complained casually that she came too late. Zhang Xuning said with red eyes, then punish the courtiers to stay and accompany the princess more. When everyone went to school in Fengchen Palace, they knew that the eldest princess of Liang had a preference for Zhang Xuning, and Zhang Xuning was naturally reluctant to leave such a big backer, and there was nothing suspicious about such a coy attitude, and it was okay to stay and talk for a while. And they came early, and they were not sure to say anything considerate, and when the sun was about to set in the west, they both took their leave, saying that they would bid farewell to the princess outside the city gates. When everyone was there, Zhang Xuning was still able to hold her face and not let her tears fall. As soon as everyone left, she took Shenzai's hand and called out mournfully, Your Highness. Spring has arrived, and there are not many flowers left in the garden. The clouds are thick all over the place, and the afterglow is obliquely shining. The palace people all stood far away, and the friends who were still laughing and laughing Yan Yan also dispersed, and only the deserted garden remained. Shenji was dressed in gorgeous clothes, but the heavy decorations were a little too cumbersome, pressing on her head and shoulders, shaking tremblingly. She looked at Zhang Xuning with a smile. Earlier, Su Shang'ai said that she was going to find you to put on makeup for me, and I said that Ning Ning was going to cry when she saw me, but when I saw that you didn't cry, I thought I was wrong, and I didn't think you would be angry at all. The end of the day is already a positive day. Zhang Xuning still had the heart to pick up her jokes, and she didn't have time to wipe her tears, so she only pulled her to get up from this pavilion and said, Your Highness, there is not much time left, come with me and go back to Mingfeng Palace first. Shenzai was stunned. What? Zhang Xuning looked around, only to see a little eunuch poking his head in this direction from a distance, guessing that it was someone from the palace who came to monitor, so he sneered in his heart, and said categorically, As soon as the matter has been arranged, you and I will return to the Mingfeng Palace, and you can leave the palace after changing your identity. In the matter of harmony, there are the best people to deal with the aftermath. As long as you can get out of the palace safely, the rest will be safe. She took Shenzai's hand and walked forward. But after walking out 2 steps, I felt a resistance behind me, and when I turned around, I saw Shenzai standing in place, looking at her with a confused look. At this moment, Jiang Xuaning's heart suddenly sudden. Shenzai repeated, out of the palace. Jiang Xuaning felt that her heart was suspended in the air by a fragile string, and even her voice trembled. Yes, doesn't your highness remember? I asked you that day. Shenzai didn't seem to remember. Before Jiang Xuaning entered the palace, she thought about the various situations she would face after entering the palace, whether it was the revelation of the matter or Xiao Shu's interception, but there was no idea that could match this moment. She felt that something was wrong. That night, Shenzai's answer was still vivid, and she repeated it to her, reminding her, on the day of my birthday, I drank in His Royal Highness's palace, and I asked His Highness if it was good to go and flee far away with his relatives, and His Royal Highness answered me, and said that he hated the Emperor's family. It was getting dark. The palace lights in the imperial garden are on. The hustle and bustle of some birds and insects near and far made it more and more cold at the moment. Shenzai was in a trance for a moment, and one palace lamp after another was reflected in her pupils, but it was just a meaningless shadow, and it didn't bring much temperature. Blinking, the cherry blossom pink under the corner of the eye trembled slightly. It's like a tear. After all, she remembered it, her heart was moved, her eyes were red, but when she smiled, she felt full of bitterness, raised her hand and gently stroked Jiang Xuaning's slightly cold cheeks, and said with tears, Silly Ning Ning, you said that you were drinking, and those words were all drunk. Bang, that string was finally broken by this fluttering sentence. Jiang Xuaning's heart hanging on the high place fell, it hurt, it woke up, and it was numb. She could barely believe what she was hearing. The mind is a chaotic mess. After reacting for a while, she couldn't help but take a step back, and said like a dream, how could it be? This is not for you to go, and it is not for you to go. Since you don't want to go, why do you want to go? I've made all the arrangements, you just need to go back to Mingfeng Palace, and you can escape from the walls of the Quartet Palace. Why don't you go? Why don't you go? Shenzai didn't think about it, she took her drunken words seriously, and after being suppressed several times, tears were still hot in her eyes. Lift up your head with all your might, so that the tears do not fall. The corner of the missing moon was hung with a dredging tree, and the cold frost light was covered on her originally pale face, but there was a strange flush because of the delicate layer of rouge on her cheeks. The wind blows, and the wide sleeves hunt. She thought that she should not live up to Ning Ning's preparation, which she didn't know how much effort she had spent, and she should have walked away from her previous naive and indulgent temperament, but there was something deeper and deeper, pressing on her shoulders and sinking into her heart. At this moment, Jiang Xuaning couldn't see her face clearly, and couldn't see her gaze clearly. Only her hoarse voice. Shenzai said slowly, everyone in the world is qualified to escape, but I can't, and I can't. Jiang Xuaning was puzzled. Shenzai stood on the steps, laughing at herself and smiling sadly, and the moonlight spread all over her body, adding an indescribable heaviness. People often say, the matter of eating the king is loyal to the king. In fact, it should be said the other way around, eating people's ointment for a living. The emperor's throne, the reverence of the royal family, did not fall from the sky. The world pays taxes, all the people are served, brocade clothes and jade food are provided, worship and worship, regard themselves as cattle and horses, and worship the royal family as gods. I am in the palace, I am arrogant, and I don't know much, but you are in the market, you grew up in the countryside, and you should know how much trouble you see. If a war breaks out, the state has a big thief, and there is no successor to loyalty, how can the war be won? The overthrow of the imperial family is a small matter, and the people of Li suffer a great crime. No matter how corrupt the court is, I am the princess of this empire after all. Jiang Xuning was completely stunned. A thought finally popped up in her heart that she had never had in her previous life. Shen Zai slowly closed her eyes, as if she wanted to suppress the surging emotions in her heart, or let the courage she muster not retreat, and continued, "Ning Ning, I don't have any deep righteousness. I'm just scared, I'm scared." Jiang Xuning's throat was blocked and she couldn't speak. Shen Zai looked at her, and there was a bit of coldness and perseverance in her eyes that she had never had before. I'm afraid that I will run away when my fate comes, and I will be defeated without a fight, and I will become a coward who is afraid of his head and tail." In the last life, how Shen Zai went to Tatar and kissed, Jiang Xuning didn't know, only knew that the bride princess in the past had slept in the coffin. She had never thought of such a possibility. This princess, who used to be cruel and pampered, went voluntarily. In the previous life, she disguised herself as a man, which made Shen Zai love her by mistake and hate her. In this life, she contacted Shen Zai and said that it was true love, but in fact, it was more out of favor to seek advantage and avoid harm. She wanted to save Shen Zai, but she just wanted to repay the kindness of the other party. But until this moment, I didn't know how ridiculous I was, and how much I missed. Having said this, Jiang Xuning felt that she should no longer be persistent and forced. After all, if a person's idea is established, how can others change it? But I am unwilling, I just don't want to. Do you want to watch her run to that soulless fate without hindrance? She took her hand and said almost pleadingly, "Don't be like this, Your Highness, don't be like this. Whether it's drunk or not, you promised me, I'll take you out of the palace, I'll take you away." Shen Zai's tears fell. Just think, it's a never-ending wish. She turned and walked away. I'm afraid that if I look at her for a while, I will repent. Jiang Xuning chased after him, and finally shouted uncontrollably, "The ambition of the Tatar wolf, and the peace of the relatives is not a plan to delay the army, this should not be the price that His Highness bears." Shen Zai's footsteps stopped. She didn't dare to say that word, but she was afraid that it would become true as soon as she said it. Looking at her back, she said dejectedly, "Your Highness, go to the country for thousands of miles, and the way back is far away. I'm just afraid that you will go for too long, and I won't see you when I miss you. The flowers in the garden are gone, and the shadows of the trees are mottled. The precious green plum tree in the corner of the garden has jagged branches, like the white bones that no one has collected outside the Yanmen Pass." But there was the sweet smell of gardenia in the air. Shen Zai turned her back to Jiang Xuning, looked at the lack of moon in the blue sky, looked around, and after a long time, she glanced back at her, but she didn't say much, just leaned over and picked up the soft soil under the tree and walked back to her. Then put the clay into the palm of her hand. "I can't tell if it's light or heavy." She wanted Jiang Xuning to smile. Her eyes were as bright as stars. "Ning Ning, don't send me." When Yan Lin led the big dry iron hooves to break through the Yanmen, he took this piece of homeland with him and came to welcome me back to my homeland and return to my homeland. Tears blurred his vision. At the second moment, Shen Zai didn't stop anymore and walked past the bright palace lamp. When her figure was about to disappear, Jiang Xuning stumbled forward and chased a few steps, but in the blink of an eye, she couldn't see anything clearly in the darkness. "Your Highness, I promise you." The hoarse voice pierced the darkness. "Your Highness, I promise you. When he breaks through the Yanmen gate with his iron hooves, I will take this homeland and welcome you back to your homeland and return to your homeland. I promise you." Chapter 169, Kiss. Dripping sound. Zheng Bao was on duty tonight, and he always felt uneasy, and he quietly withdrew until the auxiliary ministers and the emperor discussed matters behind closed doors. Back in the side hall, A small eunuch in the corner of the door shook his head at him. Zheng Bao's heart suddenly cooled. On the palace road that leads to the Shenzhen gate, the figures of the heavy guards are stacked under the palace wall, and they are dark and dark. Xiao Shu was already a little impatient when she waited. After opening the net for so long, but not seeing the prey to throw, even the most patient hunter is afraid that he will make a few mutters. She was about to find someone to inquire again, and asked for clarification, but by mistake she saw the clever eunuch she had sent out running quickly towards her. Xiao Shu immediately asked, "What about people?" The eunuch panted and said breathlessly, "Here we are, but it doesn't seem to be quite right." Xiao Shu frowned, and wanted to ask what was wrong, but there was a sudden whisper among the originally quiet guards in front. She then turned her gaze. Now she doesn't need the eunuch to explain, she has seen it clearly. Who came over from the other end of the imperial garden? Who was Zhang Xuning? Who was not her opening the net and waiting to vote? It's just very different from usual. Completely devoid of the agility and cunning that people are familiar with. Although people come over, they are like a log, their hands and feet are wooden, their hearts and souls are wooden, and even the expression on their faces with delicate facial features is wooden. A pair of delicate and white hands are holding a handful of dirty dirt tightly, no one can see it, no one cares about it, and it is gradually approaching, as if someone has been drained of the soul, and only this walking body remains. At this moment, Xiao Shu saw her terrifying appearance, and couldn't help but be shocked for a moment, shocked, and then her brows tightened fiercely. She looked behind her. No more. She only felt that things didn't seem to be developing in the direction she expected, so she first gave the eunuch next to her a look, asked Zhang Xuning to stop, and then ordered the nearest guard, "Go to Shenzhenman and have a look." The eunuch went over to stop him. Zhang Xuning's footsteps stopped. She didn't know how she got out of that imperial garden, and she was in a trance, and when she looked up and saw the eunuch, she could only see the other party's mouth open and a voice in her ears, but she couldn't tell what the other party said. Until Xiao Shu walked into her field of vision. In fact, at this time, Xiao Shu already had a faint premonition that what she was most looking forward to tonight would not happen, but the more this happened, the more she hated the excessively beautiful face in front of her. She asked directly, "Is it you who secretly pushed the peace agreement and asked me to replace Shen Zai?" Zhang Xuning replied more directly, "In the case of Yu Ruyi, is it you who framed me with the reverse?" Xiao Shu said, "If you say yes, then it is." Zhang Xuning also said, "You said yes, that's two." The two stood facing each other, staring at each other, and neither of them would give in. It's just that Xiao Shu is yin, and Zhang Xuning is cold. One is that he has already regarded the other person as his enemy in this life, and the other is suddenly detached from it and does not care very much. Xiao Shu easily sensed her contempt for herself, her pupils shrank slightly, and said, "Everyone has their own destiny to go, your background is not as good as mine, your scheming is not as good as mine, I didn't know that you also had the courage to look down on me." Zhang Xuning only felt ridiculous. Even in her previous life, she didn't think Xiao Shu was so ridiculous. In the past, I also thought that you have such a good background and such a high ability, and you are not worse than Her Royal Highness the Princess. But to this day, she is the bright moon in the sky, but when 3 points of clear light fall on her body, she feels happy, and you are nothing more than dust on the ground, so you step on it, and I feel dirty on the soles of my shoes. Xiao Shu sank her face and stopped talking. The wind whimpered faintly. Zhang Xuning held the soil, as if she was holding something lovely, and only looked at her and said slowly, "I didn't have the heart to harm you, but you framed me first because of jealousy. Xiao Shu, a long time ago, I was like you, unscrupulous in order to achieve the end. But if you are obsessed, retribution will come eventually, and it will only be sooner or later." Xiao Shu sneered, not believing it at all. Jiang Xuning knew that this was her last respect for this old enemy in her previous life, and she didn't say anything more to believe it or not, and she wanted to leave. Stop. Xiao Shu's eyes flickered, and she stopped her directly. In the deep palace forbidden, you look like you are not a person or a ghost, even if you are a former classmate of the palace. At this extraordinary time, the palace does not know what you have done, so you have to be cautious. Come on, first ask the second girl Zhang to sit down for a while, ask for clarification and then send someone out of the palace. The left and right guards immediately approached. Jiang Xuning understood after listening to her words, no matter whether she really took the princess out of the palace today, the other party has an excuse to stop her, even if she can't find evidence, staying her for one night is enough to make her suffer, maybe something extraordinary will happen again. Just like the trick of Yuruyi's case. What's more, who can not doubt her dignity right now? It's just that just as those guards were about to surround her and subdue her, a sudden and urgent voice sounded on the other side of the palace road. Concubine Xian, slow down. Xiao Shu's brows suddenly furrowed again. Jiang Xuning raised her eyes and saw that it was Zheng Bao who came quickly, and when she came to the front, she saluted without humility or arrogance, and said in an even tone, Niang Niang, the discussion over there is dispersed, and young Master Xie heard that the second girl Zhang has not left the palace yet, so he specially came to invite. People are waiting outside the palace right now, you see. Xie Wei? Xiao Shu's body stiffened for a moment, and her sharp gaze was nailed to Zheng Bao. Zheng Bao always stood respectfully and solemnly. Who in the palace doesn't know Xie Juan? Although Xiao Shu has not been a concubine for a long time, just by virtue of her understanding of the court when she was a girl in the Xiao family, she knows what a pivotal person this person is, not to mention that after becoming a concubine and serving by Shen Lang's side, she knows Shen Lang's reliance on this person. Shen Lang didn't really love her after all. She was already trying to survive in the cracks. How could she dare to risk adding another terrible enemy to herself in such a situation? Even if she was reluctant in her heart, Jiang Xuning could only let it go today. Xiao Shu's palm hanging in his sleeve was quietly clenched, but there was no flaw in his smile, and he said, since young Master Xie opened his mouth to ask for someone, this palace naturally doesn't want to stay. But I just hope that after the second girl Zhang goes back, she will restrain herself, and don't do anything she regrets. Zheng Bao bowed his head and bowed before retiring. Jiang Xuning looked at Xiao Shu for a moment before turning around and leaving with Zheng Bao. When she was far away, the guards were gone, and the palace people were gone, she suddenly smiled. Zheng Bao didn't know what she was laughing at. Jiang Xuning looked at the approaching palace gate in front of her, but her expression was full of sadness, and she only said, you don't know that Mr. Xie has avoided me for more than a month, and he dares to raise his name to save me in times of crisis, but fortunately, Xiao Shu doesn't know. But if Mr. knows, you can't eat and walk around. Zheng Bao glanced at her and opened his mouth to speak, but he still didn't explain. With him leading, he went out of the palace smoothly. It was only when she walked out of the huge palace gate and looked up to see the carriage with lights under the city wall outside, and the people waiting quietly on the wheel, Jiang Xuning was finally stunned. Zheng Bao said softly, the girl is back home, be careful all the way. Then quietly retreated. Jiang Xuning looked at the man, holding the handful of soil, but he couldn't move a step. Xie Wei flew like snow in a Taoist robe, looking at her from a high place, his eyes fell on her numb and dejected face, and also fell on the soil she held with both hands, and only called, sword book. The sword book on the side saw the opportunity very quickly, and turned out an empty box from the back of the car. He opened it and handed it to Jiang Xuning. Jiang Xuning stood stunned and didn't move. Xie Wei's eyes gradually became cold, and his voice lost its temperature. How long will you hold it? A tear rolled down from the corner of Jiang Xuning's eyes, submerged into the soil. moistened a small piece, and disappeared in the blink of an eye. She slowly let go of her hand, letting the dirt slip between her fingers. It fell into the box and filled it with a small half. The sword book closed the wooden box and was about to turn around. Jiang Xuning said, "Give it to me." Jianshu looked at Xie Wei. Xie Wei was expressionless. "Give it to her." The closed wooden box was handed to Jiang Xuning again, and she hugged it tightly in her arms. Xie Wei seemed to feel that she was not a weapon, standing on the wheel and not moving, only said to her, "Get in the car." Jiang Xuning walked over. Jianshu didn't dare to help her. She held the wooden box in one hand and the edge of the carriage in the other, and failed to board the carriage several times, only to find that her hands were shaking so badly that her legs were shaking so badly that her whole body was trembling as if she had been immersed in ice water. Xie Wei saw that she was so useless. The corners of his eyes and eyebrows seemed to be condensed with ice slag and snow foam. He couldn't bear it, leaned over, pulled her by one arm, held her waist with the other, and fished the person up with half a hug. The curtain of the car was lifted, pushing the person in. Jiang Xuning's whole person was still confused. Seeing her sloppy posture, Xie Wei didn't need to ask the first half of the sentence to know that the matter had not been completed, and everything was originally arranged properly. Ning Er was neither trapped in the palace, nor was the matter exposed, so there was only one possibility. Shenzai, the eldest princess of Liang, did not plan to escape. Only in this way can she lose her soul and make herself this disgusting ghost. Outside, Jianshu asked, "Sir, where are you going?" Xie Wei was silent for a moment and said, "Zhang Mansion." Jiang Xuning held the soil in both hands, and it was dirty, but she didn't realize it. Xie Wei didn't find Jinpsa, frowned, simply pulled his wide-sleeved robe, pulled her hand over, wiped it off little by little, but showed no mercy in his mouth. "If she doesn't want to, it's also her own choice. You are such a waste. What are you sad for her?" The carriage was dark, and there was no one else. Jiang Xuning held back her tears all the way, and all the flutters fell. Surprisingly, she didn't say anything to Xie Wei again, and only muttered, "Mister is right, it's all my fault. I don't study well, I have no ability, I have a temper, no one can save it, no one can protect it. I think I can change my life, but I am just a clown who jumps off the beam. I'm really incompetent, I'm a of shit." Xie Wei was originally angry, but where did she expect that she would have no refutation when she was untamed? When he noticed her crying, he realized that he was talking hard. Was silent for a while, and was a little overwhelmed. After a long time, he said slowly, "Silly Ning Er, you have done a lot, and you have done a good job. It's just that some things can't be turned against the tide. How old is the little girl to feel so sorry for herself? If you take out some of your past temperament, Mr. will not discipline you." I don't know if Jiang Xuning heard it or not. She sat motionless. In the distance, cheers could be heard outside the car. It was the eldest princess and her relatives who finally drove out of the palace gate and went all the way out of the city along the straight Chang'an Avenue. Jiang Xuning remembered the voice. She had heard it in her previous life. It's just that the previous life was indifferent when she heard it, and she was even happy to walk a royal sister-in-law who would make her stumble in the future. Piercing. As if you want to vent something, if you don't let go of crying like this, you will be buried in the abyss by endless depression and despair. Xie Wei had never felt that the journey from the palace to Jiang's mansion was so long and tormenting, and every sound that entered his ears was like a blunt knife cutting through people's hearts. Later, when she was tired of crying while holding the box, she closed her eyes and gradually fell asleep, and the world returned to quiet. But his heart was more noisy than when she cried. He froze in his place for a long time, as if he had settled down. It wasn't until the carriage stopped, and the sword book outside called him, that he came back to his senses. Xie Wei responded. then leaned over and wanted to call Jiang Swining, but when he got closer, the little face that had not dried his tears came into his eyes, and he seemed to be unhappy in his dream, frowning like smoke. He closed his eyes flowing, and finally he slowly reached out and stroked her soft black hair, and the two thin lips were lowered, but they were only jerky and carefully imprinted on her wet eyelashes. At this time, the sword book happened to lift the curtain. Xie Wei turned his head calmly. The sword book was creepy when it was boarded. However, he found in an instant that the gentleman's gaze had rested on his face for a moment, and then he had gone over him and thrown himself behind him, and then he turned his gaze to look at him. At the door of Jiang's mansion, Zhang Boyo stood on the steps at some point. His originally calm face had sunk, his eyes were shocked and angry, and he looked straight at Xie Wei in the car. Xie Wei's figure froze for a moment, and then relaxed in an instant. He stepped back a little, widened the distance between himself and Jiang Swining, as if nothing had happened, patted her cheek gently, and woke her up. It's home. Jiang Swining opened her eyes, was in a trance for a moment, and then said, "There is Mr. Lao." She got out of the car with the box. Staggering. Xie Wei stretched out his hand to help her. She didn't think about it and didn't feel anything, but after taking 2 steps out, she turned around as if she remembered something, and looked at him with a pair of reddish eyes. "Young master, when will the iron hooves of the Central Plain step through the Yanmen Gate and take His Highness back?" Xie Wei's dirty and wrinkled sleeve robe fluttered in the night wind. One hand was hidden in it, but he quietly clenched it, slowly bent his lips, and replied to her seriously, "Soon, soon." Jiang Swining looked at him for another moment before turning around. Seeing Zhang Boyo at the door, he only called father and went straight inside. Zhang Boyo stood outside the door for a long time, and for the first time, he saw this colleague and did not come forward to greet him with a smile, but walked away with a cold face. Jianshu knew that he had made a big disaster, so he knelt down in front of Xie Wei. "Fang is a subordinate who is reckless." Xie Wei said flatly, "There's nothing wrong with that." He withdrew his gaze, glanced at his sleeve, and turned back into the car. Jianshu was stunned, and he couldn't come back to his senses for a long time. Chapter 170, Code of Ethics. On the day when the eldest princess of Liang, Shenzai, drove out of Beijing with her own car, it is said that many people saw each other off at night, all the way to the northwest. With her departure from Beijing, the originally noisy discussion of harmony gradually subsided. In the capital, from the princes and nobles to the common people of Li, everyone's attention quickly turned to the wedding ceremony of the Spring Festival and His Royal Highness the King of Linzi, Shenzhou, who was soon approaching in April. The Qin Tianjian mansion, which was originally inconspicuous, has naturally been the most lively in recent days. Secondly, the household department Zhongshilang is on the house. Everyone says that in terms of character, talent, and background, Fang Miao, the girl of the Qintianjian family, is really difficult to compare with Zhang Suiwai, the eldest girl in Zhongshilang's mansion, but her reputation is burdened by her own unsuccessful sister, and she didn't choose the concubine in the end. But when choosing the main concubine, the side concubine was selected at the same time, which shows how much His Royal Highness the King of Linzi likes her, and how difficult it is for this concubine Fang Miao to choose. The wedding date is set for April 18th, and the 2 concubines on the front side enter at the same time. Those who hand over the post, those who send congratulatory gifts, those who set almost, those who pull relationships, those who fight the autumn wind, the threshold of Jiang's mansion is about to be broken, and even the people with them are smiling, walking with the wind on the soles of their feet, ushering in the light on the face. It's just that this does not include the maids and mother-in-law in Jiang Swining's courtyard. Far from being happy, they have become more and more sad and cautious in recent days. There was a new letter delivered to Yu Fangyin in Shuzhong. Tang Er didn't dare to fake others, so she went to pick it up in person, but on the way back, she happened to bump into Zhang Boyu, who was going out. Zhang Boyu glanced at her and frowned. Ning girl is still like that. Tang Er trembled. The girl woke up at 3 o'clock in sleep today, drank a bowl of japonica rice porridge prepared in the kitchen, and lay back to sleep, got up at 3 o'clock in the morning and looked out the window for a long time, and the dishes sent by the kitchen only used a few slices of roast pigeon, cherry meat, and a small half bowl of rice. Ding Fei Shiza sent someone to send some new gadgets, and she only looked at them twice and threw them down, and called to see the lantern festival and did not go to. Zhang Boyu let out a long sigh. What is this? Tang Er didn't dare to take a breath. Since the eldest princess of Liang went to kiss, her own girl has lost her soul, and she doesn't even bother to take a step out of her own door, watching the food and sleep, but the maids who serve her feel mad and worried in their eyes, and no one can do anything about her. But these days, the Lord has to ask the girl about it from time to time. I seem to be more concerned than before. Tang Er doesn't know if this is her own delusion. Maybe it's because the girl's recent state is very worrying, right? Zhang Boyu shook his head after thinking for a moment, and said, take good care, her sister's wedding will be in 2 days, if she doesn't want to go, don't let others disturb her, and let her raise her for a few more days. Tang Er bowed and said, yes. Zhang Boyu turned around and left with a worried face. Back in the courtyard, Tang Er saw Lianer sitting outside the house drawing embroidery, so she leaned over and looked inside, lowered her voice and asked, the girl is still sleeping. Lianer also sighed, I just fell asleep not long ago. Tang Er couldn't, looked at the letter in her hand, so she had to put it on the Kong table by the window in the warm pavilion first, and went to take care of other things in the house. At the end of spring, in early summer, the weather is not very hot yet. The 2 windows open outward, and the transparent sunlight shines on the green trees and flowers outside, the chirps of warblers and birds, and the breeze blows the light powder veil outside the bed. Zhang Xuning lay on her side on the couch. The thin spring quilt covers half of the body, on the chest. Maybe these days have been too muddy, sleep too much, and always have some bad dreams when I sleep in the afternoon. One moment is Zhou Yinzi's head, and another moment is Shen Zi's coffin. Dreams are bizarre and unpredictable. She walked through the blood-soaked court, surrounded by fog, and something seemed to be chasing after her desperately. So her steps became more and more flustered, and at last she ran wildly. The familiar cunning palace is right in front of you. She breathed a sigh of relief and rushed in, but when she stopped, she saw a thin and slender figure standing inside. Fang Yin. At this moment, Zhang Xuning subconsciously shouted. The other party turned around, but looked at her with some confusion. It was a delicate face, but the original 2 bent eyebrows were outlined a little more sharply cold, and he was used to seeing the ups and downs of the business field, but there seemed to be some helplessness and bitterness in his eyes. It's you Fang Yin. But not you Fang Yin in this life. After she saw Zhang Xuning, she was slightly stunned, and then sighed a little melancholy. It's useless to be rich in half the city, bets on both sides will open the sinner after all. Who would have thought that the overall situation subversion would actually stem from the old grudge more than 20 years ago? At this time, it is natural to give up money to save your life. Old grudges? What old grudges? Zhang Xuning wanted to ask clearly, but the words rich half of the city echoed in her mind like Hongzhongdalu, one after another, which made her panic and wake up directly from this endless dream. She opened her eyes instantly, rolled over, and sat up. The thin quilt slipped from her chest. As soon as the breeze blew outside, Zhang Xuaning's forehead was cold, and then she realized that she was in a cold sweat, and even the middle coat behind her was wet, sticking to the back of her neck, and she was uncomfortable for a while. Forgot. She must have forgotten something. In the past half a month, because she failed to stop Shen Zai from going to get married, she couldn't lift her spirits, living like a walking corpse, and like a fly without a head, as if nothing could attract her attention and was not worth her attention. But is there really nothing else? Rich half of the city. Euphanian of the previous life. Betting on both sides? After racking his brains and thinking about it repeatedly, he finally exchanged a spiritual light like lightning from Wan Nian. Zhang Xuning straightened up from the bed and shouted outside, "Tang Lianer." Lianer was startled outside. When Tang heard this, she hurriedly went to Nuan Ge and brought in the previous letter, and was about to hand it out, but Zhang Xuning reached out and grabbed it, tore open the envelope and read it. It was only at this time that the two maids saw that their girl's decadent aura had been swept away these days, and was replaced by an awe-inspiring fierceness like a great enemy, as if they remembered something important that they had neglected. Tanger was inevitably worried that her mood would fluctuate too much and cause some accidents, so she said carefully, "Girl, what's wrong with you?" Zhang Xuning quickly read the letter, but felt heavy in her heart. It's not that the situation at Ren Salt Works is bad. It's because after these years of decadence, she finally remembered, Shenzai went to kiss, and Yan Lin would indeed set foot in Tatar one day, but to welcome the princess back to the court, it was not something she could do knowing the trajectory of her previous life. There is a missing Euphanian. A Euphanian of the previous life. 4 years after Shenzai went to make peace in the previous life, the Tatars completely exposed the ambition of the Wolf Son and invaded the Central Plains. Yan Lin was ordered to turn the tide. However, when the enemy soldiers were repelled and the princess was brought back to the coffin, it was learned that the princess had been tortured and even forced to have a miscarriage 2 years earlier, because the Tatars did not want her to give birth to a child of mixed blood. Before the barbarians raised their troops, they first kill the princess and sacrifice the flag. Even if he has noble blood and pride, he is just isolated and helpless in the situation, and he is slaughtered by others. At that time, the Xiao clan was powerful, and the imperial court had to use Yan Lin to fight against the barbarians, and also beware of his self-respect for his troops, which was because there were many difficulties in the grain and grass and the rear. But the front line was not affected in any way. At that time, some people in the court were suspicious, but it wasn't until Xie Wei and Yan Lin rebelled that everyone knew that in addition to Lucien, who was in the business field, there was also the rich Yu Bankhong behind them. Soldiers are needed to fight wars, and money is needed to raise soldiers. In the previous life, they had the help of Yu Fangyan, who was rich and rivaled the country, but what about this life? Zhang Xuning sat down slowly. She saved Yu Fangyan in this life, and Yu Fangyan in the previous life did not exist in this life. And if she wants to fulfill her promise to Shenzai and rescue people even earlier than in her previous life, it means that she needs the same amount of silver taels, or even more, to make up for this gap caused by herself. Can she do it? No. It's not a matter of whether she can't, but no matter what, she has to do it. The thin page of letter paper was slowly put back on the table by Zhang Xuning. She finally woke up, blinked, and said, "Prepare pen and ink, I want to reply." Asterisk. These days, most of the civil officials in the DPRK and China are busy with the upcoming entrance examination and the upcoming palace examination, and Zhang Boyu is no exception, so he will not go to the household department today, but go straight to the Hanlin Academy. The emperor ordered Xie Wei to be the president of this section, and at this moment he stood next to the bookcase, and just received a few answer sheets handed over by the following officials. The results of the examination have already come out, and now they are the best ones in the selection answer sheet to be sent to various bookstores for triggering. Zhang Boyu looked up and saw it, and his brows suddenly furrowed. The incident in front of the mansion that day really surprised him. If it wasn't for what he saw with his own eyes, I'm afraid he wouldn't have dared to believe that Xie Wei, who was usually looking at the righteous man and gentleman and the ancient saint relic, actually did such a light beast thing. In the past, Xie Wei took care of Zhang Xuning, but Zhang Boyu never thought much about it. One is that he has a relationship with Siawei's peers, and the other party has always regarded Ningyetu as a junior. Second, Ningyetu entered the palace to accompany him, and he also said something to ask for it. Third, Siawei is not close to women, and there have never been any rumors. But it's such a person. Recently, Zhang Boyo also thought that his girl is not a person who follows the rules. Will there be any misunderstanding in the middle, or is the two of them happy? He talked to Zhang Xuning twice. Considering the girl's thin face, and didn't want her to know that there was such a thing, he didn't ask her about the relationship with Siawei clearly, but knocked on the side. In Ningyetu's words, where is the slightest affection for Siawei that exceeds the feelings of teachers and students? Therefore, it is still a big problem to thank you. Zhang Boyu responded in his heart. He didn't say anything to Siawei for a while, and now he only took care of his official business without making a sound, and when there were a little fewer people, and the people who were looking for Siawei also retreated, he finally walked over. Said first, "Young Master Xia." In the past, Zhang Boyu was called Juan. Siawei knew that the other party had something to say just by listening to these three unfamiliar words, and turned around and smiled slightly. "Lord Zhang, do you have something to advise?" Zhang Boyu looked at him and said, "The young master is young and promising, but this year is also 27, and he has not started a family for a long time. The young master taught her to understand etiquette and righteousness, and I, as a father, am very grateful. It's just that she may not be sensible yet, and she has to rely on the young master to restrain her words and deeds. I also asked the young master to be cautious in her words and deeds, so as not to cause any misunderstandings when she was young. The young master also knows that I don't raise this daughter very well, and I'm afraid that something will happen." There was a hint of caution in his words. Siawei was still holding on to the answer sheets in his hand, but he was a little unhappy in his heart. The smile on his face did not change. He didn't answer his words, and only said, "Lord Zhang can't raise it well, why don't you give it to me?" How could Zhang Boyu have expected him to say this? His face suddenly fell. He said coldly, "Although young Master Xia's ability Zhang is not as good, there is a sentence that I want to warn the young master. Although my family's Ning girl's reputation is not good, her heart is not bad. Young Master Xia misunderstands himself, don't mislead others. If the two are happy, the old man will just turn a blind eye, but the young master is Ningyetu's husband, so frivolous, wouldn't he despise the ancestral etiquette and disregard the ethics in vain?" At the end of these words, his voice was raised a little with anger. The other people in the Hanlin Academy, who were busy from afar, couldn't help but look over here, obviously hearing the words ethics compendium clearly, and they couldn't help but have a little curiosity on their faces. Obviously thinking, why are these two still involved in the code of ethics? Siawei lowered his eyes. Indeed, he is Ninji's husband. According to ethics, how can a gentleman be with a student and have a personal relationship? Merely. The few pages of the answer sheet in his hand were casually put back on the desk by him. Siawei looked back at Zhang Boyu, and said gently, "So what?